All right, Module 4, last module of the course. We've been looking at the past and the present, and now we're going to look towards the future of literacy. Two pieces here. One is we'll just talk about, in this presentation, some big ideas for the module, and then as well as your assignments for it. So, first and foremost, let me just run through the due dates really quickly. Your first due date is right after Thanksgiving. You can do it at any point between now and then. It's reading response 6. It's going to be on 4 texts. I'll talk about it in 1 second. It'll be a written response that you'll upload to Blackboard. Your first draft of the POP essay will be due on December 5th. Look for a presentation on Friday that's going to go over what it's going to take to do it and the steps you should take. And then we'll have a class discussion on December 8th, so after you turn the draft in. And that'll be on 2 additional texts that you'll read. And then finally, the final for the class of POP essay will be due on Monday, December 12th. And we'll get to all of that after Thanksgiving. Really quickly here, there's a number of different threads in this module. So before, we've just kind of focused on like one key idea, and I've given you several different perspectives on it. In this case, I'm giving you several different ideas with similar perspectives on each. And the 4 ideas are going to be an integrative framework, the idea of new literacies, disciplinary literacy, which I assume some of you have heard, and this idea about culturally sustaining pedagogies, which is sort of the second generation of culturally responsive practice. And you will be reading some texts for the discussion based on that. To give you sort of like a big landscape approach to these key ideas, I want to give you a quote from the first 4 texts that you're going to read. So you can pause for a second. I just want you to just take in these 2 pieces. This is from the first 2 pieces you'll read in the process. Next, these are from the second 2. These are the 2 disciplinary literacy texts. And by the way, content area literacy instruction is what CAL means, i.e. an English class or a block of time devoted to the social studies. So I want to point out a couple of things here. One is, there's 2 words that I think that pop out to me, whether they're stated or implied. One is this idea about multiple, right? You see in the first one 2 dimensions, right? You see this idea about literacy as being beyond a singular construct that applies to all contexts. Here in the CBIRD thing, you talk about multiple multimodal dynamic literacy practices. Really this idea here that we're not in a university where literacy is one thing. Literacy is all things all the times, and whether it's talking about technology as the second one is whether it's talking about where literacy happens is the first one, whether it's talking a bit about what actually literacy practice looks like in classrooms, really this idea about multidimensionality. And then also this idea about new. Moji in the bottom quote talks about it as well. You can see in the top quote here, this idea about participation, creating things, right? That too, when you think about technology and the access it has. So we see this multidimensionality piece here, and then we see the implications of it for instruction here, and that's really what the disciplinary literacy pieces are for, and looking for you to make those connections. Now, when we got started, I used a sort of a simple cleaving device, if you think about it, right? I gave you like some introduction to sociocultural perspectives and cognitive science perspectives. And here, and I pulled this chart from the Stone and Learned piece. Here you can see just sort of the basics of it, right? We looked at something very similar to this in Module 1, right? Here are these different perspectives, ideas on what literacy is, where knowledge is stored, etc. So you can see here the cognitive science column is probably quite obvious, right? Here's his brain as the computer, right? And the brain processes things and makes sense of things internally. Whereas you see in the sociocultural perspective, this idea about performance and evaluative. The brain's really interpretive, right? You see all those at practice and activity. The brain's really responding to external stimuli. And I know that sounds very psychological. All I mean is it's the outside world that's informing and determining comprehension, not the internal mind here. That's not to say that the mind isn't important in the sociocultural perspective, but what counts as literacy, what counts as comprehension, is determined by what's happening in the social setting. So that's where we began, where we had these two different perspectives, right? And you're going to read Stone and Learn, and you're going to see they're going to call for an integrative framework, right? And obviously, an integrative framework means merging the two or finding some sort of synthesis between them. And you can see in this graphic, which is from that text, on the left, you see cognitive science elements, and on the right, you see sociocultural elements. And in this graphic, I think the sociocultural pieces are much easier to understand than I think the cognitive science pieces, which are more neuroscientific, right? But I think if you start with the center, it's really helpful. And the two of them are gonna explain all of this, but I just wanted to give you an overview here. Notice in the central, it says crystallization, right? Embedding, internalization, whatever verb you wanna use, right? Of social practices in new neural patterns. So we have this idea that literacy is a social practice, right? But that it's also stored in new neural patterns. One learns how to do it, internalizes it, then is able to do things like, if you look to the left here, this is the brain operating in a literacy event, right? So you see things like automatic versus effortful, right? With this idea about being able to do things on cue or naturally versus having to strain and do things very deliberately, right? I want to point out the word entrenched here. They're going to describe it, but like entrenched here means thinking, the synonym is habits, right? Things that we do, like typically when we read, and those include negative behaviors as well, or behaviors that make us resistant to reading in the first place. And you can see here this biologically based variation. So this idea about genetics and inheritance and whatnot is playing a role here. So we're not eliminating that idea. But you can see to the right here too as well, this idea about cultural values and activity settings and culturally specific language and literacy practices, right? And the individual appropriation of a cultural practice, right? So literacy is this individual engaging in the social practice of literacy. All that being said, is what I'm really interested in is applying this framework to different ideas out and what it looks like in practice. So disciplinary literacy and new literacies. So in the Siebert piece, they're gonna contrast this idea of content area literacy instruction with disciplinary instruction, right? And so if you go back and you look at this idea of this image here, of this idea about cultural practices and culturally specific literacy practices, here we have this idea, if you look in the left-hand column, this idea about situated in disciplinary practices, addressing relevant literacies, focusing on strategies that are specific to the discipline. That's what we mean when we talk about disciplinary literacy, right? Participation in the discipline. And that's different. You can see from the right-hand column this idea about general literacy strategies. So an obvious example would be, many of us have taught the generic cognitive strategies like summarizing and visualizing. Disciplinary literacy is calling for something much more specific and much more attuned to the cultural features of a specific discipline, a field, a subject area, whatever term you want to use. And I think this Moji quote captures what she's getting at. So we see here this idea of disciplinary literacy connected to inquiry and connected to critical literacy, right? How questions are asked, not just asking the questions, but like analyzing those questions. And you're going to see more about what she means about that, what Siebert means about that. They have they complement one another, but Moji's idea moves past Siebert's. So yeah, I just want to give you a brief overview. This is the inquiry cycle that Moji proposes. I just wanted to give you a brief and cursory glance at it. She's going to throw out this idea that disciplines are connected in very specific ways. One is the way in which inquiry is done in them, and she's going to propose a way to do that inquiry that connects disciplines and might be a way moving forward. And this should look quite similar to the scientific method in some ways. This came out rough, but I just wanted to show you really briefly. You're also going to read about this idea about new literacies in the Loop piece. The concept is actually really quite self-explanatory. The one thing you're going to see is he's going to describe this idea about lowercase new literacies and uppercase new literacies. And the lowercase piece he's going to say is just really specifically lowercase new literacies is looking at specific literacies connected to various technology or communication mediums. So people interested in lowercase new literacies are specifically interested in the way people use literacy in text messaging, for instance, or Snapchat. Whereas uppercase new literacies is the broader theory about the way in which identity, engagement, community, and technology intersect in order to create different ways of engaging in literacy events. But the concept, you'll see, it's very technology driven. All this stuff will be quite familiar to you. But I wanted you to think really, because the assignment that you're going to be asked to do on Reading Response 6 is basically, I want you to use the Stone and Learned integrative model, this thing right here, to make sense of the concept of new literacies and to make sense of the concept of disciplinary literacy as well. So I want you to really think about, here we have a new framework for thinking around what comprehension looks like. And I want you to apply it to some of the new ideas about how we comprehend things. So next steps. On Friday, again, I'm going to upload a presentation on the research review and the journal articles that are going to help you get started planning your draft. You also get feedback this week about the lit review. I want to encourage you to check in with me. Just tell me about where you're at, just in terms of collecting data, collecting literature, questions you might have. And then just get started reading. I think you'll find these readings quite interesting. The Stone and Learned is not exactly the sexiest piece in this course, but I think you'll really like the Emoji piece. And the Lou New Literacies piece, I think, will give voice to things I think you're probably seeing in your classrooms on a daily basis.